First of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to make a presentation. Artaxias II and the murder of the Romans in Greater Armenia. The struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian led to significant changes in the territory of the Roman possessions in Asia and the allied states of the East. One of such events was the expulsion of Artavasdes, the Roman ally of King of Media Tropatena, from Greater Armenia, and the reaccession of Artaxias II, King of Armenia, in 30th BCE. The legitimate son of Artavasdes II, king of Armenia, Artaxias II tried to take the throne of Greater Armenia in 34 BCE, after Antony had captured his father and divided the kingdom between the son of Cleopatra and king of Media Tropatena. Artaxias could not retain his possession in confrontation with Atropatene and the Roman legions for a long time, and was soon forced to flee to Parthia. The situation changed radically in the 31st year BCE, when Antony summoned all Roman troops from Greater Armenia to fight Octavian. In 30th year BCE, Artaxias II, probably with the help of Parthia, regains his father's throne. The reaccession of King of Armenia was accompanied by an unprecedented act, which Rome in the East had not encountered for many years. By order of the king, all the Romans in kingdom were killed. However, this crime had practically no effect on the reign of the new king of Armenia. The alleged murderer of the Romans regained for 10 years without any interference from the Roman side, and even his overthrow room took only an indirect part. Augustus only refused to extradite the relatives of Artaxias II, who were taken out of Armenia by Antony, but the Romans did not have to fulfill this requirement in any case, since the ruler of Greater Armenia was an open ally of Parthia. In fact, there was no Roman reaction to the murder of Roman citizen. Absolute. As far as we know, majority of modern researchers unconditionally accept the message of Dio Cassius without questioning the murder of the Romans, which, according to the Theodore Mommsen, put the ruler of Greater Armenia on par with such an enemy of republic as Mithridates, king of Pontus. The inaction of the Romans in the 20s of the first century before Christ is traditionally explained in literature by Augustus' unwillingness to worsen relation with Parthia. At the same time, the Romans did not stop at a direct intervention in Parthian affairs precisely in the 20s of the first century BCE. In our opinion, the lack of response to the murder of the Romans had other reasons. It should be noted that the murder of the Romans is mentioned only in the work of Dio Cassius and once only. Also, the sources repeatedly described events directly related to Artaxias II, namely his overthrow and the accession of Tigranes III in 20th year BCE. However, in our sources, there are no direct indications of a connection between change of power in Greater Armenia and the beating of the Romans. At the beginning of Augustus' journey to the eastern possession of Rome in the late 20th BCE, it became known that a conspiracy against Artaxias II had arisen in Armenia, and the conspirators turned to the Romans with a request to put Tigranes III on the throne of Armenia, who was held in Rome as a hostage. Augustus summoned his stepson Tiberius from Italy with troops and Tigran and sent them to Armenia. Even before the arrival of Roman troops, the conspirators killed Artaxias II, and the accessions of Tigranes III passed peacefully. Thus, in the overthrow of the Armenian monarch, Rome was not the initiators of changes. The Romans obviously had no planned occult, since Augustus did not bring with him either his protege or the troops necessary for his approval. It can still be assumed that rumors about the planned trip of the princeps provoked a conspiracy, but direct Roman participation in it seems unlikely. Under this condition, the action of the Romans did not need to be justified, since they fulfilled the request of Armenians themselves. But the lack of reference to retribution against Artaxias for the murder of the Romans still looks strange, especially if to remember that the voluntary issuance of Roman legion badges by the Parthians at the same time was presented by Augustus as a brilliant victory and almost subjugation of Parthia. However, there is no direct reference to the massacre of the Romans in the Res Gesta Divia Augusti, the official propaganda version of the reign of the Roman emperor. Augustus' assertion that they could have made Greater Armenia into a province seemed to have required some kind of argumentation. And in this case, a reference to the Roman massacre by Artaxias II would be appropriate, but there is no mentions of these events in the text. Nothing is said about the murder of the Romans and the retribution of Velleius Paterculus, who twice mentions the Armenian missions of Tiberius. There is not report on the massacre by Cornelius Tacitus, who at the same time tells in detail about the overthrow of Artaxias II. Neither Flavius Josephus nor Suetonius, who repeatedly referred to the events of Armenia, know anything about the murder of the Romans. There is no hint of the crimes of Artaxias by Strabo, who left a detailed description of the position of Greater Armenia and know about the mission of Tiberius. Roman poets do not use the massacre story, in particular Horace, who mentioned the events in Armenia, Dio Cassius, who tells about the accession of Tigranes III, does not return to the crime of Artaxias. In addition, not only the silence of sources make it possible to doubt in the reliability of the report on the massacre of the Romans in Armenia, it is equally important to determine the real possibilities for committing such a crime. The source clearly states that the murder of the Romans took place after the withdrawal of the Roman garrison from Greater Armenia. Consequently, many Roman citizens of peaceful profession could come under attack of the Armenians. But how did they end up in the kingdom of Armenia? The occupation of Armenia lasted only 3 years. During this period, Roman merchants, tax farmers, artisans simply would not have had time to settle in the region. Representative of the Roman civil administration could not have been victims either, since formally Armenia was not turned into a Roman province, but was subordinate to the king, the son of Antony and Cleopatra. Granting of Roman citizenship to local residents did not have time to spread in the country. A significant presence of the Romans in Armenia during this period is not confirmed either by material sources or by numismatic evidence. More rationally, maybe hypotheses about Roman merchants who fell victim to the Armenian sword, but their presence in Greater Armenia is just an assumption. In our opinion, we can say that there were simply not enough Roman citizens for massacres in Armenia. Most likely, if there were victims, and this cannot be denied, since it was Artaxias who captured his father's kingdom, then these were Roman soldiers who might not have had time to leave a kingdom to help Antony. With the then means of communication, this would not be surprising. But the king of Armenia simply did not have the opportunity to arrange a massacre similar to that of Mithridates in Asia. How then can one explain the passage of Dio Cassius? Most likely, we are dealing with a preparation of Roman propaganda, which was not useful and therefore did not get into later sources. If we assume that the overthrow of Artaxias was one of the agenda in early years of Octavian Reign, then a strong justification was needed to justify the active action of the Romans. The same Roman propaganda present Artaxias as a victim of Antony's policy, as shown by Tacitus. The overthrow of the murderer of Romans, the new Mithridates, would be quite justified. Within the framework of this hypothesis, it is possible to consider the transfer of to Artavasdes of Atropatena, the exiled king of Greater Armenia, the control of Lesser Armenia, as a constant tangible threat to the new king of Armenia. However, the overthrow of Artaxias II did not take place, and the story of the murder of the Romans turned out to be unclaimed. And the method of the accession of Tigranes III did not require justification from Roman actions. However, in our opinion, an echo of the history of the massacre in Armenia is nevertheless, albeit indirectly, reflected in the Res Gesta Divi Augusti. Much of chapter 27 is devoted to Greater Armenia in the Res Gesta. The most interesting to us is the beginning of paragraph 2. In the case of Greater Armenia, though I might have made it a province after the assassination of its king Artax, I preferred, following the precedent of our fathers, to hand the kingdom over to Tigranes, the son of King Artavasdes and grandson of King Tigranes, though Tiberius Nero, who was then my stepson. It seemed to us that the key point of this passage is the mention of the possibility of creating of Roman province, cum possem facere provinciam, on the side of the kingdom of Greater Armenia. It is obvious that Augustus put a certain meaning into this passage about the province, because the res gesta did not always even mention the actual creation of a new Roman province, and the transformation of the Ptolemaic kingdom into a Roman province is said in one line. In modern studies, the argumentation known to us, which is given to explain the phrase about the possibility of creating a province, is connected exclusively with the explanation of the Augustus' refusal to annex Armenia to the Roman possession. As a reason, researchers cite the peacefulness of the princeps and his unwillingness to expand the borders of the state or veiled establishment of the control of Armenia, or the author is accused to distorting the facts since he had no real opportunities to create a province, or indicates that Augustus behaved differently than described in the Res Gesta, or that it's physically impossible to create a province. But as we know, no one tried to explain the key message of the phrase. Was after the death of Artaxias II that Augustus could turn Armenia into a province. Marie Louisa Chamon argued that it was a campaign of Tiberius that could become the basis of the turning Armenia into a province. However, it contradicts the text of Res Gesta, in which the description of the campaign of Tiberius goes after the mention of possibility of creating a new province. The reference to the association of the ruler of Greater Armenia clearly indicated that its possibility is directly related to the figure of the king of Armenia and not to the kingdom as whole. If to think of the link to very fact of the death of Artaxias as a direct explanation of the possible provincial future of Greater Armenia, then this is not consistent with the known circumstances of the crisis in the kingdom in 20th year BCE. The Roman troops, as already mentioned, did not overthrow or kill the king of Armenia. They only supported the request of Armenian nobility to pass the Armenian throne to the Roman hostage, Tigran III. Artaxias was deposed and killed by his own relatives. Even if the performance of the Armenian opposition was agreed with the Romans or their allies, such as Archelaus, king of Cappadocia, the Roman obviously had not planned the coup itself and, most likely, had not expected it, since Augustus arrived in the east without sufficient troops and without Tigranes III, which had to be sent to Rome for. As a result, Tiberius with legions came to Great Armenia not to seize the kingdom, but to crown Tigran III, the legitimate pretender to the throne of Artaxias. The action of Tiberius could not be anything but a show of strength and support of Roman protege. Under these circumstances, when a pretender to the throne of Armenia, specially brought from Rome, was in a convoy, the liquidation of the Great Armenia would hardly be logical. In other words, the circumstances of the overthrow and death of Artaxias II gave Rome no reason to turn the kingdom into a province. It can be assumed that since the time of Pompey's Syrian venture, the transformation of the kingdom into a province did not require detailed argumentation, and Augustus, following the already noted feature of the res gesta in relation to the provinces, did not have to mention at all the reason for the possibility of creating Roman possession on the territory of the Great Armenia. At the same time, on the one hand, the Armenian question was not as ambiguous as the Egyptian one, which really did not need any explanation. On the other hand, Greater Armenia had been a headache for Rome for decades, which is confirmed by the detailed description of the Armenian events in the Res Gesta. So as not to mention the reason for the possible creation of a province on this land if Augustus himself pointed out such a scenario. We must not forget about the coins of Augustus with the legend of Armenia Capta. In our opinion, the expressions after assassination of the king Artax should be taken not as an indication of the time of events, but as a justification for the possibility of turning the kingdom into a province. Consequently, it was the figure of the king of Armenia that could be the for the creation of the province. In other words, some criminal action of particular ruler of Greater Armenia should have made it possible to turn the kingdom into a province. Artaxias II was indeed taken in Rome as a protege of Parthians, but for the Asian kingdoms, balancing between the two powers was not uncommon, but did not become a reason for the liquidation of the kingdom. In addition, Artaxias did not demonstrate his pro-Parthian orientation in any way, and his accession could have arisen sympathy in Rome, since his father was presented as a victim of Antony's venturesome policy condemned by Augustus. And Augustus himself, who maintained contacts with Artaxias II, did not accuse Artaxias of using Parthian aid in his accession and did not deny his right to the throne. Obviously, the crimes of King of Greater Armenia, known to the Roman reader, were not only his pro-Parthian position. In our sources, one can find only one direct explanation for the formation of the negative image of Artaxias II among the Romans, the beating of the Romans attributed to him. By referring speciality to Artaxias, Augustus shows that the existence of a king on whose orders Roman citizens were killed could be a reasonable reason for turning the kingdom into a Roman province. There is no doubt about the compositional unity of the first two paragraphs of the chapter 27. The first paragraph refers to the creation of the province of Egypt, the second to the possibility of creating a province in Greater Armenia. In the first case, the reader of the res gesta did not need explanation, since the liquidation of the kingdom of Cleopatra was a direct consequence of the confrontation between Octavian and Antony. However, in the second case, it was necessary to explain not only the refusal uh, to create a province in Armenia, which Augustus did, referring to tradition, but also to point out the facts explaining the possibility of such a creation. Otherwise, undesirable association with Antony could arise, who, if to follow Octavian propaganda, particularly liquidated the kingdom of Armenia based on the personal rather than state interest. Simply starting the death of a local monarch was obviously not enough, since there was not and could not be a will to pass the kingdom to Rome. So a different explanation was required. Such an explanation was the mention of King Artaxias, whose image, as already mentioned, was supposed to cause a negative reaction from the Romans. If our assumption is correct, then what prevented August from directly pointing out the reason for the negative attitude towards Artaxias II, that is, publicly calling the king a murderer of the Romans? Most likely, the answer lies in the circumstance of the death of Artaxias, who died not at the hands of the Romans, but as a result of internal conspiracy. In fact, the king escaped a Roman retribution. So mention the death of the Romans, whose killer was not punished, would have obviously reduced the propaganda effect of this chapter of the Res Gesta. We certainly do not know how justified were the expectation of Augustus for the existence of a negative attitude towards the king of Armenia in Rome. Most likely, they are not justified given the silence of the vast majority of our sources. However, this should not surprise us. uh, Very often the propagandists themselves evaluate not the real state of affairs in the state, but the ideal model that they built with the help of their own propaganda. The peculiarities of the Greek translation of res gesta at first glance create an opportunity for even more radical conclusion, but it should be admitted that the specifics of the documents allow only cautious assumption to be made. This is due to the fact that we cannot say with certainty that all the differences in a Latin and Greek text can be explained solely by the original intentions of the translator and not by the technical circumstances of the creation of the inscriptions. Also, literature tends to claim that difference in translation are carefully considered. The Greek versions offers an almost accurate translation of paragraph 27 and 2, but does not mention the name of Artaxias. Despite today's poor state of preservation of this part of the Greek version of Res Gesta, it is obvious that the name of King of Armenia can be placed in gaps. This was already recognized by Mommsen, who noted in his edition that the name of king is absent in Greek version. In studies devoted to the Greek translation of the res gesta, almost no attention was paid to the absence of name of King of Armenia. If Mommsen pointed out the absence of name in analysis of Greek text, but did not note this fact in enumeration of the differences between the Latin and Greek versions, then, in the recent edition of the Res Gesta edited by Scheidt, the absence of name of Artaxias is not mentioned at all. If we are not dealing with the inattention of Carver or the technical features of the creation of the inscriptions, then the disappearance of the name of the king in the text for Hellenist population may indicate that his mentions seemed unnecessary. Consequently, for a resident of Asia Minor, the name of Armenian ruler was not supposed to be associated with a crime that gave grounds to the transformation of an independent kingdom in a Roman province. This suggests that the story of massacre of the Romans did not spread in the East and remains the product of exclusively Roman propaganda in Italy. It is important to note that the disappearance of the name Artaxias led to a change in the meaning of this section of the Res Gesta. So the kingdom could be turned into a province not because of the anti-Roman action of Artaxias II, but simply because of the death of the king. Obviously, this made the text more confusing, but this did not stop the translator. In addition, this, oddly enough, corresponded with the peculiarity of the Greek translation, which presented the power of Augustus as practically monarchical, in contrast to the Latin original. The Greeks, probably even less than the Romans, expected explanation for the foreign policy action of the Roman princeps. The absence of Artaxias' name is hardly connected with the translator's desire to deliberately hide from the Greek-speaking reader the specific king of Greater Armenia. Also, there is no doubt about the existence of links between the ruler of Galatia and the house or Artaxia dynasty. It is unlikely that for the inhabitants of the already Roman province of Galatia, these links were of such importance that, this led to the distortion of the text of Augustus. Thus, the story of the murder of the Romans by the order of Artaxias II, which, for objective reason, could not have a mass character, can be attributed to the sphere of the Roman propaganda, which prepared the ground for a possible forceful removal of the king of Armenia. However, a refusal of August from active steps in the East in 20 of the first century BCE apparently weakened the intensity of the spread of rumors about the murder of the Romans. The method of overthrow Artaxias II no longer required the popularization of stories about murder of Roman citizens, who probably did not go beyond Italy and were practically not reflected in the sources. At the same time, Augustus himself probably believed that propaganda had formed such a negative attitude among the Romans towards Artaxias II that it made it possible to talk about the possibility of turning Greater Armenia into Roman province. Thank you very much. Thank you attention. Thank for your attention.